It's recording. If this works, this could be all right. Good. Continue to share this window. Yes. Um, wait. All right. Which way is it? There it is. Continue to share. Yes. That's a great thing. Yes, I can. And wow, I thought I was good at tech, but she's really good at tech. Thanks, Natalia. Okay. I I'm going to start talking, and can you hear me? Okay, in the back. And all right. This headset is for the Zoom audience, and this headset is for you all. And I can't really, I mean, you'll tell me if the Zoom audience can't hear. I'm just assuming everybody can hear me fine. Oh, it's just recording. Okay. All right. Got it. Got it. All right. All right. Don't, uh, how many of errors? Welcome everybody to the Dyckman Farmhouse for for part of our summer series live on the back porch. And I'm very happy to be here. My name is Don Rice. And let's say thanks to Natalia for helping make all this happen and all of the staff of the Dyckman Farmhouse. I'm Don Rice. I was a board member for 12 years and board president for 10. And I love the history of Uptown Manhattan. And with the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, what a great opportunity to talk about the Revolutionary War in our neighborhood. And there's so much to tell. It's really an amazing story. So we're going to talk really tonight. We're only going to talk about the lead up to the battle in November of 1776. There's a whole other talks worth of material for everything that happened after that in later parts of the war. But the Battle of Fort Washington in November of 1776 is the climactic moment of this talk. And we're going to talk about all the events that led up to it. So, and New York City sort of, we think of Philadelphia, we think of Boston, we think of Yorktown as being Revolutionary War sites. We don't really often think of Manhattan or Washington Heights as being like an important part of the battles or an important part of the American Revolution. But tonight we will fix all that. Part of the reason, I guess, that maybe we've forgotten our Manhattan history is we lost the battles that took place in Manhattan. No one remembers those. And also fire destroyed a quarter of downtown, and people were more interested in the future than the past. The past was filled with fires and destruction and losing. Um, and the city was small compared to today. And New York City was more loyalist than pro-independence. So, but we're going to keep it close. So I drew a line. I used Google Maps and I drew a 5 mile line around our neighborhood. And our story is going to take place in the line, except for some big moments that just have to be mentioned, like the Boston Massacre in 1770. And this was a street riot that galvanized anti-British sentiment and paved the way for the American Revolution. 16,000 British soldiers had occupied Boston in an attempt to force British taxes like the Stamp Act or the Townshend Acts for people to actually pay attention to them. Nine, as far as battles goes, it wasn't a really battle. It was more of a skirmish. 9 soldiers were killed, five, three injured, three people were injured. I don't remember all the numbers, but it was like small numbers of people, but of great emotional impact. And then the Boston Tea Party that we all know about was against the kind of a rebellion against the British East India Company getting a tax exemption to market China tea. And everyone else had to pay this tea tax. And that's led to the no taxation without representation sort of mantra that began the cause, as they would call it. Everyone knows about Paul Revere's ride in 1770 in Boston, but we don't really hear about his ride to this neighborhood. He was kind of a messenger. I mean, he was a silversmith, but he did a lot of messenger service. And in May of 1774, he put in a bill of reimbursement to the Colonial Congress for a journey to Kingsbridge, New York, 234 miles. He delivered rebel information to other places too. And these coercive acts and the information being moved around helped unite the colonies and push them collectively towards thinking that a rebellion was a good idea. But John Adams, I mean, New Yorkers are sort of loyalists. They're trending in the loyalist kind of way. And John Adams, in 1774, he had some really good ways of putting things. And you could almost see what he's describing in New Yorkers as he describes them that year. He goes, quote, "They talk very loud, very fast, and all together at the same time. If they ask you a question, before you can utter 3 words of your answer, they'll interrupt you again and just talk right over you." And that's in his diary of 1774. Kind of rings true today. Feel free to interrupt me anytime you want. Anyway, Lexington and Concord in 1775, hundreds of British troops marched from Boston, and this is the Paul Revere's famous ride was that night. Hundreds of British troops marching from Boston to nearby Concord, Massachusetts, in order to seize an arms cache. So what this is all doing is sort of activating the residents of New England and New York. And as more and more people think about this, the debate, both yay and nay for independence, rages on, even in our neighborhood. Communities begin to organize. In April of 1775, a meeting in our neighborhood to appoint deputies to a revolutionary convention took place, and it broke down into a neighbor versus neighbor conflict. The Phillipses of Yonkers were staunchly loyalist. The Van Cortlands up in Kingsbridge were independents, and those were the 2 big landowners, and so they were both had influence in the neighborhood. And so people started to, well, there was healthy debate. Maybe I could put it that way. All right, Inwood. This is a great map from 1776, and it shows, although does the TV show it? Can you see the fields? Bits of like plowed, or this is, if you can picture North Manhattan, Marble Hill hasn't been cut off yet. So Inwood, and you can see the hillsides of Fort George, Fort Tryon, and Inwood Hill have all the trees, and then the farmland with the fields is sort of like this is what the neighborhood was that was going to be the battlefield in later in 1776. And yeah, Kingsbridge, good question, is barely visible on the far right, to where 231st Street would be today, on the site of the very edge of the Marble Hill houses, between the Marble Hill houses and the U-Haul. Yeah. So there's Kingsbridge, and this is the Dyckman Bridge or the Farmers Bridge. That's a slightly later bridge. The Kingsbridge was the original way to land route onto Manhattan. All right. News of Lexington and Concord reached New York, and New Yorkers kind of think, we're not that far from there. The work could happen to us. So they start to get in a defensive mode and start to try to protect the boundaries. There's so much shoreline, it's kind of hard to do. But they had a number of unused cannon, unused artillery lying around in the south of Manhattan, and they decided to hide those cannons. And where best to hide them? In a neighborhood that no one knows about, Inwood and Kingsbridge. So great numbers of people in 1775. Here's a great quote from the Force volume. Great numbers of people are employed hauling the cannon from the city, which is down in New York City, up to Kingsbridge, about 14 miles, where they will immediately entrench and start to work, first store some of the cannon and start to make defensive positions for these cannon too. So cannons are being dragged up Broadway all through that mud and everything, but hundreds of cannons, each one weighing hundreds of pounds. But they can do it. They definitely know how to do those things. And in May of 1775, the Continental Congress ordered forts built at Kingsbridge. The thinking was to defend the waterways and prevent the British from attacking from behind. If they kind of wanted to steer the battle to take place in off of Staten Island and in the harbor, and not so much from the Hudson above. By the way, the populations are much lower in those days. Philadelphia around this time was about 43,000 people. New York City was only 25,000 people in 1775. Boston, 16,000, and Newport, 11,000. So there were more people in Inwood now than there were in all of New York City then. If you think of the population of Inwood as 60,000 people-ish, twice the whole population of New York City. So they resolved to build forts at Kingsbridge. And that's what brought the battle here, because the forts were here. And so Van Cortlandt and various dignitaries of the neighborhood started to tour the ground and try to figure out strategically where's the best place. If you're going to set up some defensive forts, where would you put them? And they decided, at least in 1775, to make a post of 300 men erecting on the high ground for keeping the communication clear between the mainland and the city, to keep New York from being cut off. And they put these fascines, which is kind of like stacks of logs, so a cannon would hit it and not get through. So it's like manufacturing a bulletproof wall. And abatis, knock down trees, that's like barbed wire. You could string it across a road and it makes it, people get tangled up trying to get through it. So abatis and fascines, those are like, aside from mounds of earth, these are the big defensive things that a person could build or a team of people could build. George Washington is appointed commander-in-chief. And in June of 1775, John Hancock sends him his appointment. We appoint you commander-in-chief of the army. We require all officers and soldiers under your command to be obedient to your orders. And we enjoin you to be careful in executing the great trust that we've put in you. And Washington responds from Kingsbridge, where he happened to be. While I deplore the necessity of such an appointment, I cannot but feel the highest gratitude for this distinction. As to the fatal but necessary operations of war, we shall rejoice when American liberty shall enable us to return to our private stations in a bosom of a free, peaceful, and happy country. And these are kind of these words really resonate. And to think that he was in a camp around 231st Street when he wrote them, I think personally is very cool. So Washington has to figure out who's loyal and who's not. And so he asks a buddy of his, Philip Schuyler, whose daughter ended up marrying Alexander Hamilton. He says, keep a watchful eye on Governor Tryon, the New York colonial governor. If you find him attempting measures inimical to the common cause, that's a long way of saying, is he doing mischief? Use every means in your power to frustrate his designs. And that's almost like, yeah, that's really like saying, watch out for him, because we don't trust the governor. And it's possible that that trust there was a good reason not to trust him. Anyway, the cannons continued to arrive in Kingsbridge, and one person quotes that he saw 280 pieces of cannon from 13 to 24 pounders at Kingsbridge. And then later in the summer, 21 9-pounders were hauled up. So there's a lot of artillery up here. It is mostly just being kept up here for safekeeping. And then the king gets into it. So this whole talk is you're going to sense like an increasing pressure on this part of the island as the squeeze gets put on Manhattan. King George says November 14th, proclamation by the king, suppress rebellion, bring traitors to justice, make known all attempts against us. George Rex. So he's saying he means business. Thomas Paine responds in January 1776 with possibly the first viral mass communication event in America, Common Sense. How many did they sell? Did I write that down? Yes, that's a lot. That's like the population, like everybody in New York City having one. Government, he says, even at its best state, is but a necessary evil. In its worst state, is an intolerable one. And he also said the cause of America is, in a great measure, the cause of all mankind. He published this anonymously in January, and he actually served in the neighborhood up here. We'll talk about that later. Signed by an Englishman. Okay. The wariness that they had about Governor Tryon was probably very well founded, because on January 17th, the Kingsbridge cannons were put out of commission in the middle of the night. You know how cannons have there's the big hole where the cannonball comes out, but in order to fire it, there's a little fuse that comes up through a touch hole, and somebody rammed metal spikes into the touch holes and prevented them from ever being used, disabling all these cannons. They were sabotaged. And others were choked up with stones, and all were unserviceable. And this happened in the middle of the night or something like that. They were made unusable by hammering a spike, or even better, a barbed file, like for filing metal or wood, into the touch hole, then breaking it off, and so you couldn't really even grab it. So the Congress and residents who up here who were patriotic or serving on the rebel cause decided to put a guard up there. They hired a guy to fix these cannons. This is really like the first wartime event that happened in this neighborhood. They came up with a suspect. They nicknamed him Spike. William Spike Lounsbury, because he had purchased a bunch of metal files and carried them uptown. And then somebody said that they had had a meeting with the governor, and he instigated all this. Governor Tryon said, we need to render these cannon useless. So now this trend for independence had to fight against the governor. The governor was clearly not going to be working with independence for independence. Anyway, fixing cannons, we'll just run through that. They arrested somebody and he escaped onto a British ship. And that episode sort of made everybody realize, oh, the war has come to North Manhattan, because saboteurs, encouraged by our colonial governor, have been operating in our neighborhood. The clerk, the city records, out of caution, were moved up to Van Cortlandt Mansion in the family crypt. So the records of the city of New York were moved, and great emphasis and of building forts in the city started to really gain momentum. Here's an order from May 1776, ordering that all male inhabitants be employed in the fortifications of this city. The commanding officer shall draw 1/3 from the army, 1/3 from all male inhabitants, and 1/3 from enslaved Negro men. And they'll take spades, pickaxes, shovels, and hoes, and be under army regulations, pay, and provisions in order to build these forts at the top of the island. They hired an architect, Rufus Putnam, who had he built the abatis, he built the fascines. There are these other things called gabions that are baskets, and all this stuff is really meant to stop a basketball or stop a cannonball so that people can hide behind them. On my arrival to New York, I was charged as chief engineer with laying out and overseeing the works of Fort Washington, Fort Lee, Kingsbridge, and adding obstructions to the um, Hudson River. The British withdraw from Boston in March. And George Washington writes a letter to his nephew saying, "We expect a bloody summer of it in New York. I'm sorry to say that we are not, either in men or arms, prepared for it." So the whole point was to keep the lines of communication open with the rest of the country. New York, Manhattan is an island, and so is Brooklyn for that matter. And so really keeping up the British from blockading and keeping off information. Anyway, so George Washington writes to John Hancock, "I have been to Kingsbridge and find several places well calculated for its defense. Esteeming it of the utmost importance, I have ordered the works to be laid out, and soldiers from Pennsylvania will set about doing it." So that's Kingsbridge. Well, then this is towards the end of its life, when it was already cut off, and you can see there's barely any water there. They had already enlarged the Harlem River. But the loyalist New Yorkers frustrated some founding fathers. John Adams, again, "What is this reason that New York is asleep in politics and war?" He says this in June of 1776. "Have they no sense for feeling or passion? Every other colony is advancing their motions. While every other colony is advancing towards independence, New York's motions seem retrograde. New Jersey shows noble ardor. Is there anything in the air or soil of New York unfriendly to the spirit of liberty? Are the people destitute of reason, or what?" Or what? Yeah. Or what? New York sold a lot of food stuff to the Caribbean. New York was the financial center. New York was a shipping center. It, New York relied on this intra-empire trade. New York, you think it's going to not take the money? There was incentive to keep business as usual going. The three main uptown forts were built in the summer of 1776. Fort Constitution across the river in Fort Lee, Fort Washington at Bennett Avenue and 185th Street about, and Fort Independence just by the reservoir, the Jerome Reservoir in the Bronx. In July of 1776, the British fleet arrives in the New York harbor. And they land on Staten Island. And so, and Staten Island just accepts it. And basically, Staten Island is the first borough of New York City to fall with little resistance. Admiral Howe's flagship arrived on July 12th with 400 ships. So we'll see this. This will be we'll keep track of how New York falls to the British. When it's red, it's British. The time is now at hand. On July 2nd, George Washington wrote, "The fate of unborn millions will now depend on the courage and conduct of this army. We have therefore the resolve to conquer or die. Let us therefore rely on the goodness of the cause." And the rebellion was often called the cause for independence, and the aid of the Supreme Being in whose hands victory is. The eyes of all our countrymen are now upon us. So the status report of the forts. Here we can see on July 5th, find General Mifflin writes to Washington, "I find the works advanced, but not in a state where they're prepared to defend." And here's the Fort Washington between Pinehurst and Fort Washington Avenue. There's a playground here now. This is the highest elevation on the island. And the party on the Mifflin writes that the New Jersey side will soon have the ground prepared for cannon. And we can see what fort, this is a similar fort in Hagersburg. We can see that Fort Washington looks sort of the same way. Here we go with the current overlay of streets. So you can see, and actually in the playground, they have in brick, you can see they have in the paving stones the shape of parts of the fort. July July 9th, the Declaration of Independence made it to New York and was read to the troops at City Hall. And 3 cheers were given after, says the Journal of Solomon Nash. And it led to a riot of the soldiers. And there's the fence that's surrounded where the statue of King George still exists today. But there used to be a big lead statue of the king on a horse. And just a few hours after the Declaration was read, the statue of King George III at Bowling Green was toppled and decapitated. And one soldier, Isaac Bangs, said in his journal, there were 4,000 pounds of lead in that statue that could be made into musket balls for the Yankees. It is hoped that the emanations from the leaden George will make deep impressions in the bodies of some of his Tory subjects. Ooh, those are fighting words. And so the lead head of this statue was impaled atop a flagpole at the Bluebell Tavern on 181st Street. That's a Broadway and 181st, by where the movie theater used to be. There was a tavern there in the 1700s. And a loyalist, John Montresor, came up with a plan to rescue it, and he actually did. He sent a team to steal the head and bury it, and eventually returned the head. The head was returned to England. Parts of the head are in the New York parts of the body are in the horse are in the New York Historical Society. Parts of the head, the tail of the horse. The tail of the horse. I'm getting all tangled up. Sorry. Anyway, the Bluebell was dismantled in 1915 to make way for the RKO movie theater. And in July, the day that July 12th, the day Admiral Howe arrived, two British warships cruised up the Hudson and fired their guns on New York City. So this is suddenly their casualties from ships of war firing on civilians. But these British ships were surprised when they got up to Spuyten and Duyvil that cannons fired back at them. They didn't realize that there were forts being built. This was the first indication that the British had that we might fight back in New York. So they anchored off out of range off of the entrance to Spuyten and Duyvil Creek. One thing that's really cool is one of the British soldiers, he was an artilleryman, Thomas Davies, was also an artist. And he drew this probably in 1777. But this is an actual drawing made of the neighborhood. And we can see Inwood Hill. We can see the Palisades. We can see the bit of Spuyten and Duyvil on the right with a British warship in the middle of the Hudson. Oh, all right, I'll go back. If I can go back, go back. There. So it's a race against time. And we can see July 7th, July 19th, July 15th, July 21st, 150 men going up to Kingsbridge, 150 men, 100 men, another 150 men to work on these forts because it's clear that time is of the essence. Then there was this other plan to block off the Hudson River at where the Little Red Lighthouse is now, at Jeffrey's Hook. And the plan was to sink a number of old ships and link them together with a giant chain link iron chain all the way across the river, and to make a blockade that the British ships couldn't get around. so that keep the British contained to the southern part of the island. And they called it a chevaux de frise. On August 4th, 4 ships, chained and boomed, were sunk by the fort, and he wishes, and Washington, Mifflin writes to the engineer that the General Washington wants you to sink as many ships as possible for the means of obstructing the Hudson River. August 8th, the Hessians arrive. These are the mercenary soldiers that were hired by the British. They're auxiliaries, really, are existing armies that were just rented in en masse. And about 30,000 ended up fighting alongside the British. So protecting the entrance to Spite and Dival Creek, they thought was critical. Washington's paid particular attention to the works on this other side of Kingsbridge, Spite and Dival, and he desires here. It's a lot of talking and writing of letters, all kinds of great documentation about how things went here. And on August 16th, the rebels tried to set some British ships on fire by setting a small ship on fire in the middle of the night and letting the tide carry it into the British warships. The tide and the wind and the weather didn't really work out, but they did destroy some ships, just not the ones they wanted. They really wanted to destroy the frigates and the big battleships. So they called these fire vessels or fire ships off of Spite and Dival. Washington writes a memo to New York City residents. The time to evacuate is now, in August. I recommend, he says, to all persons, as they value their own safety, to remove from the city with all expedition. Because he really had no idea when this battle was going to happen. And of course, as we know, some were still loyalists in New York, and so the loyalists, if they came upon privileged information, often related to the British. And one of the loyalists relayed the secret escape route that rebels had to get through this chevaux de frise at Jeffrey's Hook, making this elaborate chain with sunken vessels kind of not effective. And so the British just sailed up the ship, sailed up the river. Dominic Serre, a famous painter, even painted this scene. Here's the Palisades, and there's Fort Washington, and the British ships knew where the opening was and just defied the Americans and said, "Oh, you can build anything you want across the river, but it won't stop us." 1,400 more men arrive into the neighborhood, and they don't have enough tents. They're begging to Washington for places that these young men can actually shelter themselves. Building a pontoon bridge, General Heath proposed a pontoon bridge at Sherman Creek, and they actually built a few in the neighborhood. So just maybe around 202nd Street across, using the same function as 207th Street Bridge is now, a pontoon bridge to help coordinate the military efforts was built. General Howe, the British head of the operations, offers amnesty to any rebels who are having second thoughts. We won't charge you we won't accuse you of treason. Just deliver yourselves to my headquarters and you will be received as faithful British subjects. And now the military actions begin. Battle of Long Island, August 27th and 29th, almost a complete disaster where American troops had to sneak out of Brooklyn in the middle of the night. Kind of genius. I'll go back. Where they were carried off under darkness to retreat back to Manhattan Island. And somehow most of the troops managed to escape. They were surrounded. They were almost completely defeated. but they managed to escape. But the result of it was that Long Island was occupied by the British. So now we can start to see what's going to happen. Manhattan is going to get surrounded. The provincial Congress orders that their records get taken up to Kingsbridge. Rebel deserters, because the only way by land off the island was to get through Kingsbridge, and soldiers were starting to desert. General Heath says that as the number of militia are leaving without license, I desire you to stop them all at Kingsbridge. One deserter was arrested with a cannonball, which he said he was taking home to his mother for the purpose of pounding mustard. And then there were ads for soldiers who had left their United States armies posted in the newspapers. $30 reward for the 3 men who deserted from Kingsbridge 2 weeks ago. So the evacuation of Manhattan begins, and that would also mean that the Dyckmans begin to leave Manhattan too. We'll talk at the end of the talk. We'll talk specifically about what we believe happened to the Dyckman family at this time. But on the 31st of August, inhabitants around Kingsbridge began driving their cattle off the island to get into Westchester County, away from where the battles would be. And in September, they completed the redoubt underneath the George Washington Bridge. There's the Chevaux de Frise. The redoubt still exists. Don't go in the sun. There's even a sign for it off the bike path. But I got to warn you, there's a lot of poison ivy there. Speaking from experience. But it's amazing, this earthenwork, because the George Washington Bridge is over it. It hasn't eroded away. And an idea started circulating among officers. What if the British do take over Manhattan? Should we leave anything for them to take? Should we burn the city? And Nathaniel Greene wrote a letter to George Washington saying exactly that. I would burn the city. George Washington wrote that if Congress should resolve that New York City should be destroyed, I would keep it a profound secret. So Congress decided for them. He said, you're not going to do it. No damage should be done to the city of New York. But it was discussed. Washington orders the breaking up of Manhattan's roads in September. That way, if the British do come, it'll be hard to get around. Heath was instructed to fell trees across the roads to make them impassable. Washington said, I request that you have the roads broke up and destroyed. September 11th, a lot is happening fast now. There was a one-day peace conference on Staten Island. Benjamin Franklin met with William Howe. And William Howe, who was sort of sympathetic he sort of thought that the Americans were sort of like wayward teenagers who could be brought back into the fold. He goes, if America should fall, I should lament it like the loss of a brother, he said. And Ben Franklin, quick to retort, he goes, my lord, we will do our utmost to save your lordship that mortification. Anyway, John Adams, Ben Franklin, Ed Rutledge, all met one day, fruitless. That was the only negotiation that happened during this campaign in New York. In September 15th, 32,000 troops land in Midtown Manhattan, East 34th Street, neighborhood called Kips Bay. Around 10 o'clock, the enemy landed, says the diarist. We, who were left in town, were ordered to retreat, and they now have possession. So now the British have the city, the lower part of Manhattan. And Washington moves his headquarters up to the Morris Jumel House, the Roger Morris House at that time. And he was there for a little while. It's worth visiting if you haven't been there. Just a day later, the Battle of Harlem Heights happens. on September 16th, around between 120th and 130th Street on the west side. You can almost see the topography. You know, where the subway comes out of the ground from south, and there's a fault line there. And you can almost see this represented in this drawing. The heaviest fighting was on either side of Broadway around 125th Street. Halfway, oh, they're getting close to our neighborhood, to us. The Great Fire of New York. Maybe arson, maybe accident. It destroyed several dozen blocks at the southern tip of the city on September 20th. On October 6th, there were requests. They'd been building forts in Kingsbridge. They'd been building a fort in Fort Washington. But what about Fort George, the eastern part of the island? And so it was requested that a fort be built up there. We can see they called it Laurel Hill at the time. And we can see Fort George Avenue. And this is at the top of the map is going down to Dyckman Street. Anyway, the highest part of the hill would be secured by a fort made of timber, strengthened with an abattis formed from the tops of trees, and a defense looking to the east. So October 9th, the British test their ability to sail through the barrier at Jeffreys Hook, and they just like butter. They just go right on through. Of course, people are shooting at them, but the chevaux de frise proved ineffectual. Okay, are you ready for science fiction? Has anyone heard about the battle submarine that was used in our neighborhood in the Revolutionary War? Yeah. During the crossfire with British ships, this submarine was destroyed. It was a one-person sub. It was known as the Turtle. It was an invention of an inventor, David Bushnell. And in the memoirs of Major General Heath, General Heath says that the enemy sunk a sloop which had on board the machine. They didn't even call it a submarine. They called it a machine invented by Mr. Bushnell, which is intended to blow up British ships. This machine worked underwater. It carried a magazine of powder fixed under the keel of a ship, then freed with a clockwork, tick, 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 tock kind of bomb, which would explode when the machine got out of the way. And they tried it 2 times, 3 times. They were unable to destroy any ships. There was an auger that was meant to drill into the wood of the ship. They were surprised that the British ships were covered with copper on the bottom. The auger didn't get through. There are still plans. There's reproductions in different museums. The museum, Major Heath wrote to Washington, the machine designed for blowing up the enemy's ships had the misfortune to be sunk by the enemy. It was still in development. It had just attempted its second mission, was getting ready for its third. I wonder if any of it is left. It was sunk off of Fort Washington. Who knows? I think it's pretty cool. So anyway, now that this chevaux de frise is useless, now the ships have free run of the Hudson River. So Congress gives Washington the authority to appropriate supplies from Westchester farms, figuring that they're going to need gunpowder, they're going to need beef, they're going to need hay for horses. These can all be appropriated and paid for, but they don't need permission to supply themselves. October 12th, the British land in Westchester. Here's the Battle of Pell's Point, October 18th. This is another one of those Thomas Davies sketches done at the battle. On October 16th, things are not looking good. Washington calls a council of war, and they debated retreating completely off the island. It was decided to evacuate New York Island in the end, with the exception of our neighborhood, with the exception of Fort Washington. exhausted troops hurriedly abandoned Fort Independence just above Target by the reservoir. Here's Inwood, Kingsbridge, Fort Independence. They hurriedly abandoned Fort Independence. They destroyed the Kingsbridge and the Free Bridge, or Dyckman's Bridge, and they burnt the barracks. He left all the cannon in the fort. He wished he had taken them with him, but the troops were just too tired. Battle of White Plains. The British were trying to cut off an American retreat from New York City. They won this battle, but they later withdrew. But now we can start to see parts of Westchester are occupied. There's really only one thing left in our story. The Hessians moved towards Inwood. October 30th, General Kniphausen, who was the general of the Hessian forces, took over the abandoned Fort Independence and started digging in. And they repaired the King's Bridge and the Free Bridge. And October 31st, somebody inspected Fort Washington and decided that there was no barracks, there's not enough fuel. There was no water within the fort. It was an open earthen construction. There were no outworks. There were no defenses that could entitle it to the name of a fortress capable of sustaining a siege. The magazines weren't prepared with enough powder. There wasn't enough ammunition adequate to the shortest defense. He wrote, it was absolutely vulnerable. And sort of in a disconnect, Colonel McGaw ordered, instead of like the essential things, he ordered to evict the cattle and hogs from the fort. What? All right. And then the final piece of the puzzle that enabled the British to come to a quick victory was another trader, another person with inside information who had worked on the fort, on building the fort, and went to the British to say, I'm going to draw you the layout of the fort, and here's the whole story. And if you wanted to have a battle plan, you should know all this information that I have. He says that he told the British forces that the rebels amounted to about 2,000. There were about 2,000 soldiers. And the plan was that if they had to abandon the outworks, like at Fort George or Kingsbridge, they would retreat into the fort. But they had only about 2 months of provisions, so a siege would work very easily. And that they didn't really have uniforms. They were much distressed for clothing, underclothed, underprepared, but full of vim and vigor, ready to go. So General Kniphausen readies his defenses in the Dyckman Flats and in the nearby hills. They come into Inwood, passed into Manhattan on November 3rd without a shot being fired at them, and he encamped really in Isham Park because there's a drawing. And let's go to the next slide. We'll get to the Isham Park drawing soon. Closing the trap, a British frigate comes up to our neighborhood just to make sure that the forces don't try to evacuate across the Hudson. The 32-gun frigate Pearl forced its way in darkness through the ineffective obstructions at Jeffrey's Hook, and although prodigiously shattered with fire from our cannons, joined its consorts in the Tappan Zee, with the loss of just a few men killed and wounded. Okay, it is decision time. It's November. Washington writes to Greene, I don't think we can do it. I'm inclined. It's not prudent to risk the men at Fort Washington. But Greene says, I cannot conceive of any great danger. The men can be brought off across the Hudson at any time. The enemy seems more like they want to besiege the place rather than attack it directly. So he thinks they've got at least a month. So they decide to stay. And there was bad weather. Captain Andreas Vederhold's diary says, we were ready to go on November 11th, but the entire division, we marched out to attack, but then a rainstorm happened and we abandoned the attack that day. And so November 14th was set as the date. General Howe arrives with the entire army. Another plan was made. November 16th was agreed upon as the date they were going to attack. And Thomas Davies Drew were looking south from the top of Isham Park. Why do I know it's Isham Park? Because there are these big glacial erratics that are well known to toddlers who play in Isham Park. And we're looking at Fort George. We can see Fort Washington here. We can see a little bit of the Hudson, the East River there, and Sherman Creek, and a little bit of Inwood Hill here and the Palisades. So we're looking south. There's a Fort Tryon at the Forest Hill, they called it. And we can see this is the day before the battle, November 14th, or a couple days before. We can lay out, oh, I just said all this stuff and now we can see it. Various landmarks that are still recognizable. Hessian fortifications that have been built rapidly. The glacial erratics, which are pretty much where they've been for the last 10,000 years. Okay, it is almost battle time. The day before the battle, November 15th, the Americans were given a chance to give up. A short time afternoon, a mounted officer under a white flag ascended towards Fort Washington and bore a summons to surrender, or the British threatened to put every soldier under the sword. McGaw said they were determined to defend this post or die. The American general said, no chance. We are determined to defend this post to the very last extremity. That night, there was a late night river meeting in the middle of the Hudson of the generals. Yesterday, General Howe demanded the surrender of the garrison. Immediately upon receiving an account of this, Washington says that I returned from Hackensack and had partly crossed the North River when I met General Putnam and General Greene, who were coming across. So we just stopped in the middle of the river and had our meeting there. He informed me that the troops were in high spirits and would make a good defense of the fort. Hessian soldiers received their battle plan. That night, Fort Washington should be captured. The next day with four attacks, 3 English and 1 Hessian. Okay, we're going to just talk about the battle now. It's kind of exciting, but I always think of like soldiers, they're people, right? So, but when I think of a battle and thousands of people, it's easy to think of them anonymously. But for the king, he had 17th Regiment Dragoons, he had Hessians, he had soldiers from Scotland in kilts, 33rd Regiment, Fort George attack, some other Hessians, Rowell's Regiment, British, Scottish, and German soldiers fought at Fort Washington. And for the Americans, or for the cause, the Pennsylvanians, mostly soldiers from Pennsylvania, and also from Maryland and Virginia. Oh, I'll take it back. If I can. There were about 3,000. In the end, about 155 were killed, but many were taken captive. Here's how the battle started. 5:30 a.m. before daybreak, Hessian forces follow the Blue Arrows. They go up Inwood Hill, where they can have a good view of Fort Tryon. They drag a howitzer up there. They overrun the people who are on top. They point the howitzer towards Fort Tryon. About 5:30, we passed over Kingsbridge in 2 columns. At 7 o'clock, a violent cannonade was begun from the ship here and from British troops in the Bronx to get everybody's attention, and they wouldn't know we were there. They would just hear a lot of noise coming from every place. So a cannonade was begun as a diversion so that they would not know where the real attack was being made. At 7, a.m., the British artillery gave a big wake-up call from the west, north, and east. Early in the morning, there became this severe cannonade. We just talked about that. That was the diversion. And at 10 a.m., the main attack begins from many directions. The Hessian, Colonel Rall, and Kniphausen came from the north. Cornwallis came from the east. Later, Percy and other British came from the south. And once again, Thomas Davies drew the battle. This is from University Heights, looking across the East River towards Inwood on the right and Fort George here. You can see the Morris Jumel mansion here in the south. And then Fort Tryon. Fort Washington is just, all you see is the embankments. Anyway, great image. And we can see the abatis that were used to block all the roads, all those little X's all over the place. We can see that a lot of the deforestation was starting to happen here on Forest Hill so that the cannons would have free visibility. And this is we'll just move over the battle scene. We could see British attacking through, that's Sherman Creek. Hessians. The area directly east of us actually was, before the apartment buildings were built, had a hill on it. That hill has been dynamited away to build the apartment buildings. So we can see Hessians here shooting up. This hill no longer exists. This is Post Avenue, Sherman Avenue. We can see lines of Hessians as they are walking south from Isham Park. We can see the frigate in the Hudson River firing. We can see the original Dyckman house, the place where the Dyckmans lived before the Revolution. It was destroyed during the Revolution. So immediately after the Revolution, when the Dyckmans came back, the neighborhood is destroyed, so is their house. They built this. It's underneath the transit yards now, but right near the East River. Okay, so General Kniphausen, we can sort of see this is the general at 5 a.m. He's entering Manhattan. By 11 a.m., he's starting to climb Fort Tryon Hill. By 1 p.m., he's attacking where the cloisters, the hill where the cloisters are, and at 3 p.m., he's approaching Fort Washington. So it's like a 8-hour battle, something like that. There's a lot of text here. We don't really need to read it all. If we could just see the line of the attack. And that is just one of the 4 or so attacks. The tides delayed an attack near Morris Jumel. Rall's attack was sort of paralleled with the other Hessian attacks. Various Hessians wrote diaries, and some of these are kind of cool. One of them in his diary said, "All regiments marched forward up the mountain over stones and rocks, which tumbled. One man fell down alive, another man fell down dead. We had to pull ourselves up the wild boxwood bushes and could not stand up properly because of the underbrush. Trees and big rocks came down, and it was hard to get ahead. Major Rall commanded march, and the drums played, the battle horns blew, and all of us that were still alive shouted huzzah as we ran towards the fort." Colonel Baxter was killed on Fort George, Laurel Hill, and Laurel Hill falls. And here's another English officer saying, "The difficulties we had to surmount were almost incredible. Hills covered with wood, almost perpendicular from the fall. It was in the fall, and the underfooting was insecure. In short, there was everything in favor of the rebels. And then he goes a little bit overboard. He says, Hannibal in his passage over the Alps could not have met with difficulties like we met in North Manhattan. All right. British generals Callawander and Graydon captured the southern defenses. One of the or this one of the American soldiers said there was nothing left to do but give ourselves up. An officer put us under the care of a sergeant who said in broad Scotch, "Young men, ye should never fight against the king." And a British officer rode up angrily, exclaiming, "Kill them, kill every man of them." And Alexander Graydon, in great deference to this angry man, said, "Sir, I put myself under your protection." And the formality of that softened the British guy and said, he met my salute with an inclination of his body and said, oh, and then, but there's kind of a lot of chaos going on. Then a Hessian comes up and says, and starts cursing at them. We won't read all this, but the stories are great. They were told that they would be hanged, then they weren't hanged. They were insulted. And during the battle, Washington and the three generals were nearly captured because Washington wanted to find out what was going on. So he started to go to the fort, and then he realized, oh my God, the battle's almost over. Really, all I can do is hope that they can make it through till nighttime. And maybe we can rescue some people in the middle of the night, like we did in Brooklyn. One hero at Fort Tryon was Margaret Corbin. She fought beside her husband, John Corbin, who was an artilleryman, cleaning and loading his cannon between shots. And then her husband was killed, and she, knowing exactly how to do the job, took over the firing of the cannon and continued until she herself was not mortally wounded, but gravely wounded. After surrender, she was paroled. She was taken prisoner and then paroled. Um, and then she received a military pension. Supreme Council after the war granted her $30 and recommended her for a regular pension, which was granted. Not much to say. You can see the X's, X, 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 X. That's all the skirmishes that led to defeat in our neighborhood. One diarist writes that one of their bagpipers, can you imagine the battle happening and there's bagpiping in this neighborhood? One of the pipers who began to play when he reached the summit of Fort Tryon was shot, and he tumbled down the hill from one rock to the other until he reached the bottom. The rebels ran into the fort, and this is the beginning of the end. Washington sent a messenger to say, can you hold out till nightfall? Sent him across on the ferry. What street would this be? 175th Street or something? And here's Thomas Davies's view of that ferry. We can actually see Fort Washington there on the far right. And this is Fort Lee here. So the battle is pretty much over. The remaining American troops retreat to Fort Washington under pursuit. Washington, viewing it from across the river at Fort Lee, was said to have wept at the sight of the unequal contest. The enemy numbered 8,900, Americans only 2,800. They did not have a chance. So Colonel Rao called one of his captains to take some terms into the fort. and the commander of Fort Washington asked for 4 hours. He was granted only a half an hour to decide to surrender or not. Of course he did. He surrendered. People really respected how good the Hessian soldiers were. He said that the Hessians make impossibilities possible. Probably the Hessians were responsible for the defeat. And the English took many prisoners away to New York, downtown New York, into prison camps and prison ships. And they renamed the fort for the Hessian general Kniphausen, who had taken it. So on a lot of the military maps from 1777 and onward, it's Fort Kniphausen up there, not Fort Washington, not Fort Tryon, Fort Kniphausen. Being taken prisoner was almost certainly a death sentence. 2,800 American soldiers were captured, and the majority died over the next 18 months imprisoned in these ships like this sitting in the New York harbor. But the Hessians grudgingly respected the American fighting style. One Hessian wrote, "They lie singly behind trees, bushes, stone walls, and rocks, shoot at long range and with certainty, and run away very fast as soon as they have fired. The Germans cannot shoot a third as fast, and still less catch them running." So respect, but defeat. What comes next? Blame the boss. Joseph Reed to Charles Lee. Both the plan of defense and execution were contemptible. If a defense of the lines was intended, the number of troops was too few. If defense of the fort only, too numerous. An indecisive mind is one of the greatest misfortunes that can befall an army. Charles Lee writes to George Washington, "Oh, General, why would you be over-persuaded by men of inferior judgment to your own?" Because he took advice of his generals. It wasn't quite over. The British really wanted to capture Washington, and they knew he was in New Jersey. So a few days later, on November 20th, Cornwallis staged a surprise attack, marched his men up to Yonkers, and across the river there, where you could climb the Palisades, and down towards where Washington's troops were. Around daylight on the 20th, an American officer riding patrol 5 or 6 miles north of the fort was surprised to find a huge advancing enemy army. And the officer wheeled back to the fort where the Americans were, shook people out of bed, and said, "We got to leave now." And of course, Thomas Davies drew that scene. He had an eye for when it was going to be the right moment. And here they are crossing. This is opposite Yonkers. Where is it exactly? I thought I had written it down. But then anyway, the Americans barely escaped. Thomas Paine was a soldier there. He had written Common Sense. And he wrote, "I was with the troops at Fort Lee. The bridge over to Hackensack was just 6 miles from us, but only 3 miles from them. Washington arrived and rapidly marched the troops toward the escape of the bridge. We took as much baggage as the wagons could contain, but the object was to save the garrison." And the British did capture a lot of stuff. In addition to the 2,800 soldiers, they did an inventory. At Fort Washington, they captured 4 32-pound cannons, all this stuff. In Fort Lee, a lot more, including inventory of bullets and shots and cannonballs, muskets, cartridges, wheelbarrows, trenching tools. And they recorded all of this. You can look it up. The American Revolution is well documented. But now, look at that. Now even New Jersey is taken. Washington was able to escape. And one writer wrote, Sir William Howe, the British general, fell back to the enjoyment of his barren conquest, a deserted and somewhat destroyed city. And because of this, because of Thomas Paine's close call, just a month later, he wrote a very famous quote. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny like hell is not easily conquered, yet we have this consolation with us that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. And then the American officers started to actually think about what had happened. Washington says, I'm wearied almost to death about the retrograde motions of things. It wasn't a good year. But someone wrote to him saying, well, we stopped Howe with the finest army that the finest army that ever appeared in America, with ours as bad a one that ever appeared in any part of the globe. So we did good. We were just overwhelmed. Yeah. Yeah. We're almost done. Here's what's left in the neighborhood. Fort Washington, or the remains of many soldiers buried beneath Fort Washington Avenue, 180th to 181st Street. They're still there, mostly dust now. The Chevaux de Frise across the Hudson still has the retaining hooks that held the chains by the Little Red Lighthouse. These ancient things, they look like talons. Below the George Washington Bridge, which you can see, there's a DAR marker, Fort Tryon. But let's just quickly talk about what the Dyckmans were doing. William Dyckman, who built this house, had 4 sons. Jacobus Dyckman was the oldest. He was in charge of not screwing up. So at first, they sold. He made a deal with the president, with the king, to sell supplies. Later, he had a change of heart and moved over to the rebel side. His younger brothers had no problem with the ethics of just being rebels and not. They didn't need a king. Brom Dyckman died in action towards the end of the war. He ran towards battle. Mike Dyckman loved his brother Brom and just stuck with him through thick and thin. They were guides when Washington and his French generals came back. So they helped the French and the Americans come back in 1781 to decide how to win the war. Eventually, they did it in Yorktown. William Dyckman, 4th son, was a drummer boy. He was too young to fight. Among the Dyckman women, several of them were married in and living in Westchester County and endured terrifying situations where people were trying to take all their stuff. The Dyckmans, when they left the city, they were leaving with livestock. So how far can you go in a day with cows? You're going to go see relatives on your way. And someone has done a scholarly paper of possibly staying with brother-in-law William Hadley. Jacobus and Brom and Mike stayed in the middle of Westchester. The older folks, William, moved further up until the end of the war when they would come back. And that is where we're going to end it today. Thank you. It was a lot. Thanks for sticking with me. There was just so much to say. Anyway, questions? Yeah, yeah, that's a very good question. And it has been discussed every once in a while in the neighborhood. Every once in a while, someone says, why are we naming this after the governor who tried to sabotage the revolution? Um, but because they won the battle, after Fort Washington was renamed Kniphausen, and for Fort, what was it, Forest Hill Fort, which was became Fort Tryon. Yeah, I know. Another? Yep. Yeah. Oh, I do not know. Yeah, you could probably find that out though. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Sounds like a different Lee. Yeah. I don't know. Having a hard time hearing. Yeah. Yes. I think there was somebody, I don't think it was Washington who ran and dove, but there were close escapes. And when Washington and his generals did come like in the middle of the battle to see what was going on, they had to leave very quickly because there was danger that they would be trapped. They made it to the water and back to Fort Lee, but they got halfway up. They didn't get all the way up. But I think you're right. There was also a story of somebody escaping and getting into the river afterwards, a soldier. No. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thanks, Holly. Yeah, yeah. Did I see? Yeah, yeah. I hear you. I'm thinking it had to be informally. Certainly wouldn't have been anything official with rebellion. It would have been happening, uh, not announced, you know, word of mouth to just friends that kind of thing. That would be my guess. Okay, thanks for coming, everybody.